Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum, and I actually have a little bit of scar tissue right about here, underneath which is about a square centimeter of 45 Colt brass cartridge case shrapnel. And it's still in there because it would have done more damage to dig it out than to just leave it alone and put a couple stitches over it. This is the result of an incident that happened about 6 years ago now. This was back when I was still part of InRange TV, and we published a video at that time about not specifically gun safety, but do you know what to do if there's an accident at a shooting range, if someone gets hurt? Which is, I think, still a very valuable question to make sure that you have an answer to. So at the time, we didn't discuss what specifically actually happened to me, and it's been long enough that, frankly, I probably should. There are some lessons to be learned from it, both from an individual personal safety perspective at the range, and I think it also does one little tiny bit of helping shed some light on some various historical firearms trials, in particular the development, or lack of adoption, of tube magazines, because that's the gun, and it was a tube magazine. But before I get to that, I want to bring up the question of, do you know what to do if there is an accident at a range? I did a video a little while back on a TCCC emergency trauma course, and there's some interest in it. I think it's not quite as sexy to a lot of people as going out and playing with guns, but it is, I believe, a very important part of anyone's skill set. And I've started working with Refuge Medical. I actually have one of their IFAKs on my basic range bag now. The guy who founded Refuge Medical is actually a big fan of the channel. I had a chance to meet him in person. We got to talking, and he was interested in helping to support the channel. So we set up a collaborative relationship, an affiliate relationship. So Refuge Medical primarily makes a whole wide array of first aid kits. Everything from that little IFAK, individual first aid kit, to bigger emergency car bags with a whole bunch of stuff. You get into a major casualty event, and this can help a whole lot of people. If you use the discount code IAN at Refuge Medical, you'll get 10% off of any of their pre-built first aid kits, and I also get a small percentage. Goes to help support the channel. They also have training available at a variety of different places around the country in trauma medicine at several different levels. That's at refugetraining.com, and that discount code IAN will also get you 10% off all of their training classes. So I have the link and the code down in the description. If you don't know what to do in case there is an emergency at your shooting range, or if you're just around people who have car accidents or building accidents, or someone gets shot some other way, it's valuable to know what to do. And Refuge Medical, Refuge Training are one among many very good options for making sure that you know the answer. So with that said, let's get back to what happened to me specifically. So the rifle in question was a reproduction Henry, and it was one that used the original authentic style of magazine tube. So this is chambered for 45 Colt center fire. This, what happened here really isn't an issue with rimfire ammunition, but of course nobody makes 44 rimfire anymore, and so all the reproductions of things like Henry's are in centerfire cartridges. 45 Colt is a particularly common one. So to reload this, what you do is you grab the follower and you pull it all the way up to the top, and you can then, this one's a little finicky because, there we go, you can then rotate the top section of the barrel here. You've got the spring all compressed up in there. Rotate this off to the side, and then you can roll the gun onto its back and load cartridges down the magazine tube. Now, we needed some B-roll footage. We didn't need it fully loaded, you know, like 5 or 6 or 7 rounds would be fine. Just get a couple shots on camera. And so I loaded the tube about halfway up, and then here was my big mistake. I took it, rotated it back, and whoop, let go of the follower. Now the manual specifically says always drop the follower gently, and I should have, because what happened is this generated enough energy accelerating under spring pressure without anything to resist it, that when it hit the top of the cartridge stack, it detonated the top 2 cartridges. Now, mechanically speaking, I think a lot of people would expect that this could only happen if you had, for example, a primer that was set a little, not set flush, that was exposed out, or obviously if you had a pointed bullet in the middle of a primer, well, yeah, then that kind of impact could clearly set it off. Well, in this case, neither of those were true. These were flush-fitted primers. You can actually still see the primer on that bottom case, and they were flat-nosed bullets. And yet, this was able to generate enough energy that I believe what happened is the anvil and the hammer inside the primer itself hit each other. They contacted energetically enough to actually detonate one of the cartridges, which then sympathetically detonated a second cartridge. So fortunately, it wasn't all of them. It was just the top two. But because this magazine tube is open, and I was holding it like this so that I had access to the top, the resulting powder and brass shrapnel, unimpeded by this open slot, came out right like that. So a couple implications to this. First off, I was wearing shooting glasses and they did their job. So I don't know what would have hit me in the eyes, but I had a nice batch of powder spackling all the way up the side of my face in the aftermath of this. And it was thanks to my shooting glasses that nothing got into my eyes. Nothing had a route to get into my eyes. You can have irreversible, permanent eye damage very quickly and very easily, and shooting glasses are a very simple precaution. Always wear shooting glasses. There's absolutely no reason not to. Secondly, I am very happy that I didn't happen to have my hand over the magazine tube where one of these rounds detonated. I don't even like to think about what that potentially would have done to my hand. Thirdly, as I said, this was while I was still part of InRange TV. Carl was out there filming for me. We had a first aid kit on site, knew how to use it. So we actually pulled a trauma bandage, and there's no good way to really apply pressure to this. So what we ended up doing is I essentially stripped off my shirt, made sure that there wasn't a more serious injury, check for, you do a drag, you check for other injuries. I have a video on a TCCC trauma course that talks about a lot of this sort of stuff. And then once we recognized, okay, it's not a huge serious thing, I'm bleeding a bit. There's a fair amount of blood, it felt like, ended up on my pants and shirt and the shooting mat that I'd been sitting on. But we pulled out a piece of gauze, packed it onto the bleeding area, I applied pressure to it, and we drove off to a hospital. Turns out, there's a lot of horror stories about you show up to a hospital in the US and you sit in the waiting room for like 7 hours before they see you. Turns out if you walk in with a big trail of dried blood down your chest, holding a bandage on yourself, they see you pretty darn quick. They got to me very quickly until they realized that turns out this actually was a relatively minor injury. It was a penetrating trauma, but it was very shallow. Nothing was in serious danger. Then it took like 4 hours for me to get 2 stitches and be discharged. But knew where the hospital was. We knew how to get there. We knew the immediate first aid to apply. This sort of stuff comes in handy. And it all turned out to be fine. No lingering problems of any sort. From a historical and mechanical perspective, I think this is an interesting data point. Obviously, it's just a single data point, but it supports what we see in some of the trials reports. For a fairly brief time, the underbarrel tube magazine was the best solution for a magazine-fed repeating rifle. And you'll see a bunch of these mostly up before smokeless powder is invented. You see a bunch of black powder tube-fed guns. The Mauser 7184, the French model 1884, well, 1878s, 1884s, 1885s. The whole Kropatschek system essentially was this and was adopted by a bunch of different countries. But you also see countries that start to test tube magazine guns and experience detonations in the magazine tubes and decide to adopt other systems like the Lee magazine instead. And it's not long before the other magazine systems replace the tube magazines entirely. And that is in part because magazine tube detonations, while generally rare, as long as you take precautions, can absolutely happen. And this is a really good example of one that you wouldn't expect. Like on paper, this shouldn't have been possible because it's a flat-nosed bullet, it was a flush-seated primer. None of the really obvious reasons that you would think of for a mag tube to detonate. But with the right circumstance, namely this follower getting up fast enough because the magazine tube wasn't full when I dropped it, gives that thing enough energy to detonate a primer without needing to actually poke it like a firing pin. So it's not the only time or a rifle like this has had a mag tube detonation. They are fairly rare, but they do happen, and that's a large part of why this mechanical system fell out of favor. Now, had this been a rimfire gun like an original Henry, I think this problem would not have been able to happen, because when rimfire is fired, what you actually have to do is crush the rim of the cartridge, and that happens between the firing pin and the wall of the barrel face. With the center fire systems, you have a self-contained primer with a hammer and an anvil inside it, and the firing pin serves to crush those two together. And that's a much more delicate system. With a rimfire, they're just really, even if you get a lot of velocity in this follower going down, it's not going to be able to crush the rim of the cartridge in this way. It's also interesting that had this been, say, an 1866 Winchester, the problem could have still happened, but it would have been a lot less severe, almost certainly, because the wooden handguard encircling this magazine tube would have constrained the blast. Like, the shrapnel would have gotten stuck in the handguard, I'm sure broken the handguard, but it wouldn't have come flying out where it would end up lodged in my chest. And so this is kind of like the worst possible case, and it for good reason. Like, it's the earliest gun using the earliest version of this lever action system with the open magazine tube slot. Just to reiterate, the Henry manual does say, don't do what I did. Lower this follower gently and slowly, and I highly recommend that you follow that advice. I should have. That's on me. But it remains, well, I think it's interesting to see how this affects firearms procurement. This is something that doesn't happen very often, and it's especially something that doesn't happen very often where you have a direct view to it. So that's interesting in a historical perspective. And of course, it remains always important to know what to do if you have a medical emergency at the range. Even if you don't do something stupid like I did, the guy next to you could hurt himself, hurt someone else at the range. If you don't have medical training, medical kit, I would suggest looking into it. There are a lot of good trainers out there. Of course, I have a relationship with Refuge Medical, Refuge Training. You get, again, 10% off any of their kits or training using the code Ian, but there are lots of other good medical trainers out there, and if there's a particular one in your area that's convenient, absolutely, medical training is a great thing to have. So hopefully you enjoyed this little sort of background sneak peek. Thanks for watching.